Hello everyone. Welcome to Knitting 101, Learn to Knit. My name is Kelly, and today I'm going to be walking you through how to work the knit stitch. To start off, we're going to learn how to cast our yarn onto our needles, and then we're going to work through the knit stitch itself. And at the end, we're going to learn how to bind off a piece of knitted work. While we're going through all of that, I'll be discussing a little bit about some of the really common errors that come up while you're knitting, as well as a little bit about how to go about fixing those. All you're going to need today for this class is some knitting needles, some yarn, pair of scissors, and if you have it, a tapestry needle, something big enough to thread some yarn through it. And also you want to make sure that it's not very sharp at the end. It should be much more rounded than sharp. When it comes to the supplies that you're using today, you can use any knitting needles and any yarn if you have it at home already. I would recommend for beginners to use a knitting needle that is a little bit larger, a number 10 or a 10.5. You can actually see on most knitting needles, they'll have the number at the end labeled. If you're buying knitting needles, you'll be able to buy in whatever size you'd like. Larger needles tend to be a little bit easier to handle when you're starting off. When it comes to your yarn, I would recommend a worsted weight yarn. And you can usually tell that it's a worsted weight yarn by the label here. You'll see what looks like a little skein of yarn. It'll have a number in it, and a number 4 represents worsted weight yarn. You can also get something a little bit bigger than that, bulky or super bulky yarn. You just want to make sure that it's easy to handle, but yarn that's too small could become really difficult to manage. If you're looking for yarn to purchase, don't forget to check out some local vendors that you might have near you and support a small business. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the cast on. The cast on that I'm going to show you today is called the E-loop cast on. It's a very basic cast on. It's the very first cast on that I learned, and it's extremely versatile. Because it's moderately stretchy, you can use this cast on for most projects. And typically a project will call for a certain cast on, but if it doesn't, then this is a great option to use. Before we start, I'd like to identify some terms that I'll be using through the program. The first is the tail of your yarn, which is the very end of your yarn. The other is your working yarn, which is the yarn that's attached to your ball or skein. To start a cast on, we'll use the tail end of our yarn to create a slip knot. A lot of people like to use a slip knot when they're starting their cast ons. For most projects, I tend to avoid this, and I'll explain why a little bit later in the knitting portion of the video. But for the purposes of practicing today, starting with a slip knot helps the first stitch stay in place so that you can continue learning very easily. I'm going to begin showing you the cast on, and as I do so, feel free to follow along. I'll do my best to go slowly, and I'm going to be doing the cast on for several minutes, so you'll be able to follow along if necessary. To begin, you'll hold the knitting needle and the tail of your yarn in the same hand. You'll use the working yarn to wrap around your 2 fingers, and through this loop, you'll pull up another loop and insert your needle through it. If you pull down on both the tail and the working yarn, and then tighten the working yarn, you'll create a slip knot around your knitting needle. This becomes your first cast on stitch. From here, you'll continue with the E-loop cast on. To do this, hold the first stitch on your needle tight, and with the working yarn in your other hand, you can wrap the yarn around your finger and use the tip of your knitting needle and insert it through the loop on your finger. And you can see that the yarn is forming what looks like a lowercase letter E, which is how this cast on gets its name. If you pull on the working yarn, you can pull that taut, but not too tight, right up next to that first stitch. And you've now cast on your first E-loop stitch. Again, you'll wrap the yarn around your finger, use the tip of the needle to go right through that loop, and pull the working yarn taut, but not too tight. Continue to wrap the yarn around your finger and insert the tip of the needle and create stitches until you have the desired number of cast on stitches for your project. Depending on your project, it may ask you for perhaps 20 stitches in the case of a scarf, or it may ask for something more like 100 stitches in the case of perhaps a blanket. For now, don't worry about counting your stitches. We're going to continue casting on stitches for the entire length of our knitting needle. This is going to get us very used to the feeling of casting on stitches. Once you get used to the feel of this very basic cast on, you'll be able to do this very quickly. You might not even need to think about it. As a reminder, be careful not to pull your stitches too tight when you're casting on. That would make your first row of knitting very difficult to accomplish. Remember to simply wrap the yarn around your finger. Use the tip of the knitting needle to insert right through that loop and pull it taut but not tight. As you get more stitches on your needle, you can slide the stitches down to give yourself some more room. Wrap that yarn around your index finger. Use the tip of the needle to insert through the loop and pull it taut. As I mentioned in the introduction, when it comes to the supplies that you're using, it doesn't matter what kind of knitting needle you're learning on, but I would recommend learning with an aluminum needle just to start off. It has a very good tension when it comes to the type of yarns that you'll be using, so your stitches can slide very easily, but not too much. Continue casting on for the entire length of your knitting needle. And if you get to the end, then you can take the stitches off and start over and just continue practicing. we're going to do this for about 15 minutes. You may notice your stitches starting to curve around your needle like this. If they do that, it's totally normal. It's just the nature of the way your cast-on stitches fit onto your needle. And you can very easily spin your stitches around your knitting needle to create one straight line. And this really doesn't impact your knitting at all, as long as when we go to do the knit stitch, we're knitting in the right place. So continue casting on. And we're just going to keep practicing this cast on. Be careful not to leave too much space between your stitches like this. Pull them right up next to the next stitch. When you're doing your cast on, that will help prevent spacing issues and tension issues in your first row of knitting. Once you get used to casting on, the spacing between your stitches will become much more consistent. It's not the end of the world if your spacing is a little off. It's just helpful for that to be consistent. Continue working the cast on until the end of your knitting needle. And again, if you get to the end of your knitting needle, you can remove the stitches and start again to keep practicing. If you do that, it's really easy to just pull the needle out of all of your stitches, and you'll see that the stitches will fall right out and you'll have no knots except the very first slip knot in your yarn. If you give the tail of that slip knot a little tug, that'll come right undone as well. You can start again. So you can see I have almost my whole needle filled up. And we're just going to continue practicing that cast on to really get comfortable with it. We want to make sure that your cast on is something that just feels second nature to you. The cast on is something that you'll use for every single project that you do. And this E-loop cast on is a great go-to when you're not sure what to use. Okay, so you can see I've cast on just about my entire knitting needle of stitches. But of course, for a normal project, this would be much too many for a simple scarf or dishcloth, something like that. So for the purposes of today's lesson, we're going to cast on much less than this. So what I'm going to do is remove my stitches from my knitting needle by just pulling them off the knitting needle. You'll see your yarn start to unravel. All of this yarn here, all those loops were just loops right around the stitches. So just until you get to the slip knot there, and if you give that a little tug, that'll come right undone. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to cast on a specific number of stitches this time. First, if you'd like to make a slip knot, again, you'll hold your tail in your hands and wrap the working yarn around your first two fingers. Cross that tail. Then you'll reach down through this loop, pull up another loop from your working yarn. And through this new loop is where you'll insert your needle and pull down on your yarn to create a nice taut slip knot on your needle. We're going to cast on a total of 15 stitches today, including this first stitch from your slip knot. So using the E-loop cast on, we'll continue with 14 more stitches. So that's 2 stitches, 3 stitches, 4 stitches, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. You can always go back and double count to make sure you have the right number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Looks good. The next step that we would be doing is to start knitting. And to do that, it's really easy. All we'll need to do is take the needle and insert it right into this cast on edge. I'll be showing you how to do that next. Before we do that, I just want to point out that if you have any issues with your cast on stitches, now would be the time to fix it before you move on to your knitted project. Also, if you're working on a project that needs to be a certain width, the cast on itself is not a good measurement of how wide your project itself will be. That is something that you would want to make a swatch for at the beginning of your project and do measurements for, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this lesson. So we're going to go ahead and start learning how to work the knit stitch. Now that we have cast on our first row of stitches onto our left-hand needle, we're going to pick up our second needle and we're going to start from the tip side of your needle and work your way down the stitches across this row. The first step is to take the tip of your second needle and insert it through the first stitch. just like that. Then you're going to take the working yarn. This is the yarn that's attached to your ball of yarn or skein, and you're going to wrap it around the needle towards the back, and in this case counterclockwise. If you are a lefty, then it would be clockwise around your needles. Then using that first needle, you're going to pull this yarn through your first stitch, just like that. And then finally, pull the first stitch off of your first needle and let that drop. So now you have one stitch on your second needle and your remaining stitches on your first needle. At this point, you want to pull your stitch together so that it's somewhat taut. For the purposes of this video, I'm trying to keep things a little bit loose so that you can see where everything's going. And you can certainly do the same, just know that the tension of your knitting will be much different if you do that. And once you get more comfortable with it, you won't have to keep things so loose. So again, to work a knit stitch, you're going to insert your needle on what we call the back side of this stitch on the front of your needle. You're going to insert through the loop, and then you're going to wrap your working yarn around your needle. You want to remember to pull that away from you when you're working around. You do not want to wrap around the front like this. This is a no. This is a yes. And pull that yarn through the stitch and then drop off the stitch from your first needle. So if you were counting along right now, what you would see is that the first two stitches you've made here have eliminated stitches on your first needle. So you'd be down by 2. In reality, you are building stitches up in rows, and you'll be able to see that a little bit better as we do some more rows. So to break this down very simply, there are 4 steps to each stitch. The first is insert, where you insert the tip of your needle into the next stitch. The second step is to wrap your yarn. Remember to wrap away from you and bring that yarn right up between your 2 needles. The third step is to pull that yarn through, and then you're going to drop off the stitch as your 4th step. So again, that's insert, wrap, pull through, and drop. If you are struggling to remember all of the steps, it's really easy to say that to yourself. Insert, wrap, pull through, and drop for each stitch. And as you become more comfortable, this will become second nature for you. Again, that's insert, wrap, pull through, and drop. A little note on where to put your needle when you're inserting the tip of your needle. You always want to make sure you're going through the loop, not in between your stitches. If you do this, you'll end up dropping a stitch, which we'll cover in common errors a little bit later in the video. So again, you're going to insert through the stitch, wrap your yarn, pull through, and drop. I'm going to take a minute to just tighten things up a little bit. I also wanted to point out that you can see now there's a gap starting to form between your two needles. With an E-loop cast on, this is very normal. And at the end of your row, there will be a little bit that we can tuck in if you use a slip knot, or if you don't use a slip knot, you don't even have to worry about it. We'll continue working these last few stitches and talk about that a little bit more when we get to that point. So insert your needle, wrap the yarn, pull that yarn through, and drop it off your needle. Again, insert, wrap, pull through, and drop. 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 I do want to point out as well that when you're pulling your stitch through with your second needle, you want to make sure to pull that stitch all the way down to the full width of your knitting needle. This is very important for gauge, especially when you're making a project that requires a specific gauge. If you don't do that, your stitch is going to end up being the width of the tip of your needle, which could be much smaller than the actual stitch that you need. So remember, after you insert and wrap your yarn, right here when you pull this yarn through, make sure the new stitch is coming down to the part of the needle that is the full width of your needle. Make sure it's past the point of your needle before you drop it off the other stitch. And just two more now. You're going to insert your needle, wrap your yarn, pull it through, and drop it. And this is the very last stitch, and what we're going to do here is the same 4 steps, but you're going to see that this gap remains when we're done. So you're going to insert your needle. Also expect that slip knot to be a little bit taut, but it'll slide open a little bit once you've put your needle through. And then wrap your yarn, pull that back through, and drop it off your other needle. As you can see, we have a bit of a gap here, and because we have a slip knot, what we can do is just pull this gap up a little bit to tighten it, and then really it's just playing with the knot a little tiny bit. You should be able to tighten that up. You just kind of have to play with it back and forth a little bit. Or you could at this point undo that knot and you'd be fine as well. And I think in this case that's what we're going to do here. We're going to try to just undo this knot a little bit. And I can show you what the difference is between using a slip knot or not using a slip knot when it comes to doing your cast on. But at this point, we can go ahead and just tighten up our stitches, and we've completed the first row of knitting. And you can see very simply that our knitted piece is already much wider than it was before. It can stretch much further than it could when we had just the cast on. On the bottom, you'll see a nice row forming, which is your cast on row and a little bit of your knit stitches. And at this point, you can always count your stitches again to make sure that you haven't added or dropped any stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It looks like we're good to go. So to start your second row, it's actually really, really simple. All you have to do is flip your needle like this. So you have essentially what you had before with your cast on, just with an extra row. And then you take your second needle and you do the same thing that we just did, and we'll repeat that row after row after row, and that's how you knit. So this row looks a little bit different. We want to make sure that when we're inserting the tip of our needle that we're going right through the stitch and not between two stitches. That's very important to prevent dropped stitches. Go ahead and insert your needle, wrap the yarn, pull it through, and we'll slide the stitches down the needle a little bit so it's easier to drop them off. Don't forget that we're using aluminum needles, so it is quite easy to move your stitches up and down. And if you need to take a break from your knitting and set these down, all you have to do is slide your needles a little bit further down so that nothing can drop off the ends, and set your needles down, and you're in good shape to walk away for a few minutes if you need to. When you pick up your needles again, it's easy to see where you're working from by identifying where your working yarn is located compared to your tail. And if you see the working yarn is coming out of one of these stitches, then you know that's the last stitch that you did. So we'll go ahead and slide this towards the end again, and we'll insert our needle into the next stitch. We'll wrap it around, pull it through, and drop it off the needle. We'll insert it, wrap it around, pull it through, and drop it off the needle again. Insert it through, wrap it around, pull it through, and drop it. Insert, wrap, pull through, drop. Insert, wrap, pull through, drop. At this point, you can start to see a little bit of your knitting forming below your work, and these are the stitches that are growing as you're knitting. So even though you're dropping stitches off of one needle, you're not getting rid of them, you're just letting them fall below to the row that they live in. I also want to share a little knitting rhyme that can be very helpful when you're learning to knit, especially in remembering the steps. And it goes a little like this. Go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. Go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. At this point, you're getting more comfortable with holding your needles and your yarn. But if you're struggling with it, one tip that I have found to help is that you can use one hand to hold both needles here when you need to wrap your yarn, and then you can pick up your second needle again in your other hand. A little bit later in the video, I'll show you a way to run the yarn through your fingers so that it carries at a very even tension, and it will help make your stitches be just even. You won't have to worry about your tension as much. It will come just naturally with how tight of a knitter you are. So this is our last stitch on our needle again, and that completes our second row of knitting. And you can see again the knitting can still stretch as nicely as it did last time, and you're starting to get a little bit of your work coming down here as well. At this point, it would be really difficult to start identifying errors, but usually if you go up a row or two, you can start seeing an error that you might have made. We're going to go ahead and count our stitches again to make sure that we didn't drop anything or add any stitches, and that'll be a good indicator in case we need to go back now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Great, we're in a good spot. So again, we're just going to flip this needle around, and you can see that we're going to start knitting again just like we did in the last row. So we're going to insert the needle right in here through that first stitch. We're going to wrap the yarn, pull through, and drop it off the needle. Insert the needle, wrap it around, pull it through, making sure to get down to the full width of our needle, and drop it off. Insert, wrap, pull through, and drop. 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 Again, if you need to set your needles down in the middle of something you're working on, just slide your needles down further, or I should say slide the work down further on your needles, and you can go ahead and set those down for a moment. When you come back to it, all you need to do is look for where your working yarn is coming from, and that's the last stitch that you completed. So we can slide our work a little closer to the ends and prepare to continue knitting. So we're going to insert, wrap around, pull through, and drop. Or go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. Go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. Go through the front door and around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. We're going to go ahead and complete these last 5 stitches that are on our needles. And then I'll go ahead and show you in the next row how to hold your yarn to create a more even tension. All right, 3 more. And almost done. And the last one. There we go. And drop that. You're starting to see even more of a work of knitting here. You're starting to see a ridge of bumps forming. And if we flip it to prepare it for the next row, you can see those bumps on the other side too are here. All right. One thing that's really common is you'll see in the very last stitch of your row when you flip it that it's kind of loose. And that's pretty normal. You'll see that a lot. It doesn't make much of a difference to try to pull it tighter, but you'll notice that by the next time that you go up a row, it's going to be about the same tension. It just looks a little different because it's right on the end, but it is very normal, so don't worry about that if that happens. Just keep going and you'll see that it kind of straightens itself out. Okay. So before we start with this next row, I want to show you how to thread the yarn through your fingers so that it helps create an even tension. What you're going to do is you're going to use the 2 middle fingers here, and you're going to scoop up your yarn, and then your 2 outside fingers are going to go underneath your yarn like that. And then once you do that, you're going to wrap the yarn around your index finger once like this. So you can see it goes over your pinky, under your ring finger and middle fingers, over your index finger, and then around your index finger one more time. So what happens when you do this is that it creates tension in your yarn, so you should be able to slide the yarn relatively easily. And if you don't want to slide the yarn, you can close up your fingers and then you can't pull that yarn through at all. When you're holding a second needle, again, you can scoop up that yarn, put your other 2 fingers under, and wrap it around your index finger one time. This allows you to hold your knitting needle pretty easily, and you can still insert the needle. You can wrap the yarn around very easily, and then you'll just let that yarn slide down a tiny little bit each time. You pull through the stitch, and then you drop it off your needle. So when you get comfortable with this, you probably won't even know that it's there. It'll just slide right through your fingers, and the tension that you're creating with each stitch will become more regular as you go. It also just helps that you don't have to set down your yarn and pick up your yarn after each stitch, because it's already available right there on your finger. So as you can see, after each stitch, I'm not pulling my hand further away than I normally would. I'm just letting that yarn naturally come through my fingers. And if your yarn gets a little bit too far out, you can pull back on your index finger to keep it taut, and then the yarn won't move through your hand so much the next time around. This also helps your knitting become just a little bit more quick. As you can see, we did this last row at a much faster pace than what we were doing before. And again, the last stitch there, and we've completed our next row. Now if we flip this and we look back at the first stitch from this row, you can see that that one big stitch really isn't there anymore. So like I said, if you have that happening, don't worry too much about that, because it'll just go away as you're knitting. This sort of stitch here. Nothing to worry about. Okay, so what we're gonna do is take some time to just keep working this knit stitch, and take about 15 minutes. You can pause the video, and when we come back from working on that stitch, you can also replay the video if you need to see any more stitches. But when we come back from that, we're going to learn a little bit about what garter stitch is, which is what you're already making, and then some of the really common errors that you might find. For those of you who are getting stuck, I wanted to take a minute to go back over how to cast on again. And you can always rewind the video, but if you're going through start to finish, I figured it'd be nice to just do it a second time. So again, you're going to take your first needle and the tail end of your yarn. You're going to hold those two things together, and you're going to use the working yarn in your spare hand, wrap that around your index finger, insert the tip of your needle, and then pull that taut. And I actually want to point out that in this instance, I'm not starting with a slip knot. I'm just starting with the cast on stitch. It's really important, if you're doing this, to hold your tail of the yarn at least until you do your second stitch. But once your second stitch is on there, your stitches are locked in and will not fall off of your needle. I really prefer this method to using a slip knot because it's a little bit faster for me. And I find that when I am completed knitting my first row of stitches after the cast on, I don't have to fiddle around with a slip knot at all. I don't like the way that results at the end of my work. I also wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the speed of a cast on. And I am going a little bit slower than I normally would, just to let you see what I'm doing. But if you keep practicing, you can see this actually becomes a very quick thing to do. If I was doing a lot of stitches, I probably wouldn't even be counting. I would just be threading on some stitches, and then I'd go back and count and see how much more I needed to do. You can see it does become just very, very quick, and casting on a large number of stitches doesn't take a very long time. So always just keep practicing, especially if you're just playing around. You can always just cast on an entire needle worth of stitches for practice. And when you're done, you just slide that needle right out and your yarn is ready to use again. So again, if you want to start a cast on without a slip knot, just hold the tail of your yarn in one hand while you complete the first 2 stitches, at which point in time you'll be locked in, and if you wanted to set this down and walk away, you could. You'd be perfectly fine in doing that. But we're going to get 15 stitches back on here, and then I'm just going to continue knitting some rows while you guys are practicing and getting comfortable with the knit stitch. And once I have a few rows knit, I'll start discussing some of the common errors that come up with beginner knitters and even with experienced knitters, and how to go about fixing them. One more. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that this may look really easy, what I'm doing, and you may be struggling, or this may come more naturally to you. But if you are struggling, just remember that learning something new takes time and practice. I like to equate learning knitting, at the very least in the physical aspects of it, how your hands are holding the needles and how you're moving the yarn and manipulating those tools, to learning how to use silverware for the first time. So many of us don't remember doing that, but if you're a parent, you might know what it's like to have taught children how to use silverware. And you couldn't just put it in their hands and they know how to use it immediately. They're going to watch you do it a little bit. They're going to practice it. They're going to fumble over it. But over time, it's going to become so second nature that you can't even remember how you learned how to do it. And that's very much what knitting is like. So if you're struggling, just remember you have to practice and get through that hard time. And take your time learning, be kind to yourself, and you'll get it. Now I wanted to show on the very last stitch of the first knitted row, when you don't use a slip knot, you still want to be careful to hold this tail of yarn, because if you let go, you'll lose that last stitch, and ultimately we would be down 1 stitch in our row. But as long as you hold that tail when you insert the needle and complete your last stitch of this row, you can pull that tail taut, and you're now locked in at the end of that first row, and your tail is safe. So that's how easy it is without a slip knot to be able to start a cast on row. And then you just turn your work and you continue knitting just like you normally would. Another tip, especially if you're working a project with a lot of tails, for instance, maybe you're doing a scarf that is striped and you have to switch colors of yarn every few rows, is to use your tail with your working yarn on your next row and just knit both of them together. And this will help weave in the tail of your yarn. And you only have to do this for a few stitches. So you just want to use both of those together and make sure that you're pulling both of them through the loop through the stitch right here. So you're getting both of them. That's what ultimately makes them tuck in together. So I've just done 5 of them, and from here forward I'm just going to continue using one strand of yarn instead of both of them. And we can go back and cut that remaining tail now, and that end has been woven in and it'll be secure in this project. And that's just really helpful if you're doing something like a project where you have a lot of ends coming your way. Don't forget to push your needle all the way through the stitch that you're creating here to create the full width of your knitting needle to get the right gauge. And this is the last stitch there of that row. So now you can see, again, we're starting to form some decent rows here. You've got your cast on edge, and this is your tail now that we can go through and just snip off. I'm actually going to wait to do that until we're done with the next row and really see what we've got. I'm going to keep knitting now. As we move forward with the video, I'm going to do my best to address the most common issues and errors and how to fix them if it's easy enough. But just as a reminder, there's a wealth of information online, and a quick YouTube search can help you find some videos about a number of different issues when you're knitting. Also, I mentioned about a website that you can go to called Ravelry, and Ravelry is a great source for help if you need it in the forums for beginner knitters. I want to point out, now that I've gotten to a point where I've got the tail carried with my stitches, you want to pick up both of these loops instead of just one, just like that. You want to treat both of those loops like they're one stitch. If I knit through both of these like this, I'd end up increasing the stitches that are on my needle, and we don't want that. So make sure you're knitting through both stitches. Just get right through both of them there. All right, one more row down. At this point in time, we can go ahead and cut this tail off because we know it's not going anywhere. And we have a nice, clean, crisp edge without that tail sticking out. So the stitch that we're currently creating is called Garter Stitch. This is formed when you repeat knit stitches on both the right side and wrong side of your work. Garter stitch can be identified by the rows and ridges of bumps that you create, which you'll start seeing how they form the further up your rows you get. But you can see that we have one ridge of bumps right here, and one ridge constitutes 2 rows of stitches. If we flip over, you can see this ridge right here that constitutes 2 rows of stitches. And garter stitch is a little bit thicker. It is a little bit warmer. And all you have to know to create garter stitch is how to cast on, how to knit, and how to bind off, which we'll learn a little bit later in the video. But if you repeat knit, stitch, row after row, you'll come up with a garter stitch item. Garter stitch is, I'd say, pretty common, especially if you're knitting something flat. If you're knitting something in the round, you typically won't see garter stitch. But for things like scarves, blankets, any hats that might be knit flat and then seamed, things like that, you'll see garter stitch being used more readily. If you end up in a situation where maybe you've pushed your stitches too far and you've knocked off an extra stitch, don't panic. Just take a deep breath and slide that stitch right back onto your needle. One thing you don't want to do if that happens is pull your needles apart, because that's going to create a dropped stitch, and that can be much more difficult to fix, especially when you're first starting off and you're not as comfortable with how the different stitches work together. So just remember to take a deep breath and don't pull your needles apart. Perhaps even set your needles flat on the table if that happens to you, so you can just assess what's happening. So you can see I'm starting to make a good swatch here. I've currently got 2 visible ridges and then a half ridge with my cast on row, and this is a good view of what garter stitch looks like. If you flip it over, you can see that there's 3 ridges here, and again, each ridge constitutes 2 rows of knitting. If you give it a little bit of a tug, you can see those individual rows a little bit better. So in this next row, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it's like if you drop a stitch. So perhaps you're going along and either you don't realize that something has slipped off and you move to the next one, or perhaps you don't realize that you've inserted your needle between 2 stitches. And even if you complete all of the steps, when you slip that stitch off, it's actually not hooked into anything. So then what happens is you continue moving down the rows, and you find out later that you have a dropped stitch. So one thing that you can do is, if you notice it right away, you can go back stitch by stitch to fix it. You can see right here that I have that dropped stitch. So what you would do is you'd go back individually, one stitch at a time, and place it back on your first needle. You do want to be careful with this, because if you pull on the knitting too much, you could drop the stitch down an additional row, and you want to try to avoid that. But as of right now, you can see that we've come right back to the dropped stitch. I'm just going to pick that up on that first needle, and then we can knit it just like we would have, and continue knitting down our row. Now, what happens if you get an extra row up? So I'm going to go ahead and drop this stitch off, and then we're going to finish this row. And we're going to turn our work. So now perhaps you didn't see that you were missing a stitch in that last row. And so you're knitting down, and you get to a point where you notice, whoops, that one slipped off my needle before I was done knitting it. Going too quickly. So, I see that I've got a stitch that dropped a few rows ago. Well, what do? My knitting here is already going. I can't just go back and fix it. But actually you can. What you're going to want to do is use something like a stitch marker or a needle, or if you have a crochet hook, just to pick up that one stitch so that it can't go any further down. Now, if you have a crochet hook, now would be a good point in time to use that, because we're going to try to pick up these other rows of yarn that are left over. But before we do that, I want to point out it's very helpful to slide your needles down before you start doing this until we get to the very last row. So if you have a dropped stitch, what you're going to do is you're going to pull this bar back through this stitch. We're just going to be very careful with that. And now we have another stitch there. Now on this next one, we want to flip our work around and we're going to do the same thing. But the reason that we're flipping our work around is because of garter stitch and where we want to create the bumps. And that will come with a little bit of practice, recognizing where the bumps are and recognizing what side it has to go on. But when you're knitting, the bump is always going to be at the back. So now that I have this stitch all the way up to the top row, and I have no more bar here, I'm going to put this stitch back onto my knitting needle, just like this. And because we did not have a row with yarn intended for that space, it will become a little bit tight, to the point that in your finished work you may even notice a little bit of tension. But if you are careful about it, once you block it and finish your piece, wash it out a little bit, it should even out at least a little bit. So flipping this back around, we can see that my working yarn is coming from one stitch over. So the stitch that I just picked up, I need to just slide or slip right back to my other needle so that I can pick that up and work it as a normal stitch now. And you'll see when we're done with this row that the dropped stitch is no longer there. Now, sometimes you might find that you dropped a stitch several rows ago, or it's possible that you only dropped it one row ago, but that it slid down several rows. And what you can do is exactly what we were just working on. You just have to do it up each individual row until you get back up to the row that you're on. So you can see here the drop stitch was right in here, and you can see that it's a little bit tighter there. As we continue knitting, we'll see that that loosens out just a little bit. So that's the first really common error. And a drop stitch will ultimately result in you having one less stitch on your needles. So especially if you have a specific stitch count that you were supposed to cast on, that would prevent you from getting the right number in your rows. So I'm on that stitch that was dropped, and I can feel when I insert my needle how tight it is, but I just want to keep going. Because it'll all even out in the end. Ooh, almost lost that one again. Okay, so again, you can see where that stitch is really, really tight in there, so it looks like the row is a little bit different. But if we left it be, you would get what they call ladders going down each row, and it would just look like a bar in each row going down all the way to the bottom eventually. We don't want that. There are actually patterns that ask you to do that, but that's not what we're doing here today. A drop stitch often results in either, like I said, if you actually drop one of your stitches off a needle like this, or again, if you insert your needle between two stitches instead of through a stitch. So always be careful of that when you're doing that. Okay. Another common error is if you slip a stitch, and it happens a lot if you're not thinking about what you're doing and completing each stitch through the 4 steps: the insert, wrap, pull through, and drop. So a slip stitch happens when you just insert and you don't wrap around, and then you pull through. There's nothing to pull through, so then you just drop it off your needle. And really all you've done is slipped it from one side to the other. Now, slip stitches are also a common stitch that are asked for in patterns. Usually it'll be at the beginning or the end of a row, and it helps create a better edge. And it can also be used in knitting to create different patterns of stitches, but I'll show you in a second why. If you slip a stitch, it's not going to change your stitch count at all. All that's going to happen is you'll see that you have one stitch that carries up for 2 rows instead of just one. And let me just find it here. It's actually right here, and you can see because this stitch has 2, this stitch has 2, this stitch only has 1 row. So that's what happens in a slip stitch. When you're doing garter stitch, you can't make it out very easily. So it's not the worst thing in the world, especially because it doesn't impact your stitch count at all. But if you're doing other stitches, especially stockinette stitch, it's a little bit more visible. And you can see here that it does impact the rows and ridges a little bit as well. The next common error that we're going to talk about is a yarn over. A yarn over results in an additional stitch, or something you'd call an increase, as well as a hole in your work. And what happens with the yarn over is that you bring the yarn around the needle, but you haven't inserted the needle into a stitch like this. And then you continue on down the row. And what you'll see is that you have a stitch here that's not connected to a stitch in a lower row. You've just created a stitch. I'm going to complete this row and show you what it looks like on the other side and talk about how you can fix it. And as we're coming across here, you can actually see the slipped stitch from the row before. If you wanted to fix this, now would be a perfect time. You could reach in and pick up that bar and switch that onto the other needle, and then you've fixed a slip stitch, and then you would just continue knitting that, and you'll find that your knitting is a little bit tight on your next row. But we're going to continue going and looking at the yarn over here in just a moment. So if you are working down your knitting and you find that you come to a stitch that just kind of looks more open than the rest of them, then you'll be able to recognize that it's a yarn over. And and we're just about there. Okay, so you can see how open that is. At this point in time, if you wanted to fix this, all you have to do is drop this off of your needle. What does happen though sometimes is that you'll continue knitting, and I'm going to show you what that looks like, and you'll be left with an open hole on the next round. Now, in lace work, yarn overs are actually called for often in knitted garments. So this is a skill that you will want to know how to do at some point in time if you're interested in doing something with lace work, or even some buttonholes for very small buttons. Sometimes use just a simple yarn over. There's also some very popular patterns called feather and fan patterns that use yarn overs and dropped stitches in different rows to create a particular pattern, and those can be pretty fun. So now that I've completed the next row after my yarn over, you can see that there is quite a large hole in the knitting there. At this point in time, if you continued knitting, there's not a way to go back and fix that. So from here you would want to go back one stitch at a time. We call that tinking, which is knitting backwards, K-N-I-T, backwards is T-I-N-K. So if you wanted, you could tink backwards. In this case, you'd have to go back 2 rows until that initial yarn over had been knit. And you can count and see that we have an additional stitch at this point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, when we started with 15. So that is what it looks like when you have a yarn over, and at this point really the only way to fix that would be to go back stitch by stitch until you got there and fixed that. But if you were on the row before and you dropped the yarn over, you could do that as well. That would create a little bit of loose tension through the knitting there, but it wouldn't create such a large hole like this. It would just make things look a little bit loose, similar to how the slip stitch and the fixing of the drop stitch is just a little bit tight. This would be a little bit loose. But we're not going to go back and fix that now. We're going to continue forward for just a few more rows so you can continue practicing how to work the knit stitch. And then we're going to discuss how to bind off your project. And binding off is how you will end all of your projects. It's very simple. There are a couple of different ways that you can do it, but the one that I'm going to teach you today is far and wide the most common way of doing it, and it's pretty simple, and it can be used in just about every single knitting project if you choose to do so. So why do we bind off a project? Why can't we just take the knitting needles out and be done with it, or sew an edge or something like that? Well, if you were to just remove this needle, you currently have live stitches on here. Currently we have 16 of them. And if you're just going to take this needle out, all of those live stitches would be free to do whatever they want. So binding off is a way that we can close off those live stitches so that you can remove your knitting needles and have a finished piece without an edge that will ravel or unravel as time goes forward. So I'm going to finish up this row here, and I'll show you how to go about binding off. It is quite simple, and it still uses the knit stitch as a base to it, and we'll see how easy it is to accomplish that. And then we'll talk a little bit about weaving in your ends with a tapestry needle, and then that will round out our lesson today. So we're just about done. All right. So once you've knit as far as you want to knit on a piece of work, it's time to finish the knitting. And all we have to do is close off these live stitches that are sitting at the end here. So to do that, you actually start by knitting the first 2 stitches just like you normally would. So knit 1 there, knit a second one. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the first stitch that we just knit on this needle, and we're going to pick it up and pull it up over the second stitch here. So just insert your needle backwards like this and pull the second stitch through that first stitch and drop that second stitch that you just pulled over right off that needle. So now you're down to 1 stitch here. You're then going to knit 1 more stitch and do the same thing. You're going to take the first stitch here and pull it over the second stitch, and just use your needle to pull that through the loop and drop it off. Knit another stitch and use the first stitch and pull it right over that second stitch. So the stitch that's staying on this needle here should be attached to your working yarn. You can see how that flows together. And you keep going right down the row. So you knit an additional stitch like you normally would, and then you pull that first stitch over the second stitch, just like that. Knit another stitch like you normally would, and then pull that first stitch over the second stitch. I will caution you here to go slowly, as going too quickly can cause you to push your stitches here off this needle, and tends to be a reason why some people can get caught up and have difficulties at this stage. But again, you're going to knit a stitch just like you normally would, and then pull that first stitch over the second stitch like that and drop it off the needle. Knit a stitch like you normally would, insert, and pull it over that second stitch. Knit another stitch like you normally would, pull the first stitch up over the second stitch. All right. Knit the first stitch, pull that one up over that second stitch. Knit another stitch here, pull that first one up over the second one. You do want to be careful not to make this too tight, because if you make this too tight, you will really struggle to get to the end. But you can see how we're starting to get a nice clean edge here from the bind off. So knit another stitch like you normally would, and then pull the first stitch up over the second one. And you just keep doing that. You knit another stitch normally, pull that first one up over the second one, knit another stitch normally, pull the first one up over the second one, knit another stitch normally, and pull the first one up over the second one, knit another stitch like normal, and then pull the first one up over the second one. And now that we're on the very end, we're just going to pull this out a little bit so you get a nice big loop. You can take your other knitting needle out, and you're just going to pull up the working yarn through that loop, and go ahead and pull that nice and tight. Okay. Now we can snip off that little bit and pull the rest of this out, and you just have a new tail. But you've finished off your end here. I'm just gonna tug at the work a little bit in both directions and kind of get it to lay out a little bit more flat and even. And you can see that we've created a nice clean edge along the top of your knitting. This is what a bound off edge should look like. It doesn't look too different from your cast on edge, but it does have a little bit of a different look to it. But both of them are a nice finished edge. And now you don't have any live stitches left for your knitting to be able to unravel. All right, the last step from here is to weave in your end. And for that, we're going to use a tapestry needle. You'll want to make sure that it has that wide eye and not too sharp of a tip there. And we're just going to thread this. Now you'll notice that I left quite a long tail, and that's just so that you have plenty of room to work with as you're weaving in your ends here. People like to do this a lot of different ways, but the important thing is that you just go back and you catch through a few stitches, maybe 5 or 6 stitches, so that the tail can't come out and unravel further. So what I like to do is come down through here and just follow along the stitch for about, like I said, 5 or 6 stitches. And just try to make that like a clean edge. So we're going to follow right through here. And we're just going to follow along this row of stitches for just a little bit. Some people like to go down a few stitches and then turn back on it on itself, and they find that that's a little bit more sturdy. And some people like to just sort of loop right through the ends here. And I would say that it depends on how you finished your bind off. off. In our case, the tail was already pretty secure, so this weaving in ends is not as functional as it is aesthetic. But if you needed something that was much more functional, perhaps you're weaving in the end that you've recently color changed so it's not knotted anywhere. That might be something that you need to do a tighter or a more secure weaving in of the ends. But I'm going to stop there. You can see that there's this doubled up edge here, but for the most part, it really doesn't impact your knitting all that much visibly. And over the course of a very large project like a scarf, that would be a very minimal way to weave in your ends. So I'm just going to snip that off. And we have a little swatch here of our knitting. So it's really important to make swatches like this for projects, especially if they need to have a certain fit to them. And the reason that we do that is because you can use something called a gauge to determine if the gauge that you knit at is the same as the person who created the pattern, and therefore if you'll be getting the same size garment as another knitter. So all you have to do with this is lay it over a piece of your knitting like this, and this will help you count how many rows and columns you have per inch. So in this case, I'm lining it up right along a column of stitches here, and I can just follow these bumps right up there, and then along a row as well here. And I can see if I count stitches, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 stitches in 2 inches. And because a ridge is 2 rows, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 in this inch. So per inch I have about 7 rows by 3.25 or so stitches. And a pattern would give me a particular count for that, and I would be able to tell if I was knitting smaller or bigger. We'll address that a little bit more. I believe there will be a video on finishing and substituting yarns, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about gauge for that. But in the meantime, you do know how to achieve that, and you know how to measure for that. So this completes the lesson on knitting. You have just finished how to bind off and weave in your ends. This concludes our Knitting 101 Learn to Knit lesson. With the basics that we've covered today, you'll be able to knit anything that's worked flat, such as scarves, blankets, dishcloths, and so many more. If you're looking for a great resource for some free patterns, visit www.ravelry.com. That's Ravelry. This website is a free resource for thousands of patterns, and there are also forums for discussion, for tips, and just tons of inspiration. While you're practicing, don't forget to take a deep breath if things aren't going quite right, and take your time. There's no rush. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. Thanks so much for watching, and knit on.